Hello, church history friends. My name is Barb Walden, and I am speaking to you from my home here in Indiana. Tonight, I have the joy of welcoming you to our third evening lecture in the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation's Summer Lecture Series. We greatly appreciate you joining us this evening to hear Dave Brock share the fascinating story of Edward Ellsworth Guy. And now, before we begin tonight's lecture, I want to introduce you to two of our fabulous co-hosts. Our first co-host is Peter Smith. Peter is a dedicated member of the Board of Directors for the Historic Sites Foundation, and he's served as an enthusiastic co-host for our annual Historic Sites bus tours since 2013. He's practically the face of the foundation at this point, and I love it. I also want to spotlight Megan Reed, another important person who will be serving as a co-host tonight. Megan is working on her master's degree at Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. This summer, she is serving as a student intern for the Kirtland Temple, and she'll be assisting behind the scenes throughout the lecture series. In fact, Megan is here tonight thanks to your generous donations given to the Community of Christ Historic Sites Foundation in support of the Alma Blair Internship Program. Thank you for your generosity. Although the historic sites are temporarily closed for public safety due to COVID-19, the stories from church history and the preservation and maintenance of the historic sites continues on even in the midst of a pandemic. Donations from tonight's lecture help support the Community of Christ Historic Sites. Thank you for your generous support. Megan has also dropped an online donations link in the chat box. Donations can also be sent through the mail to the address Megan provided for us as well. Thank you, Megan. But now for the main event, our evening lecture. Tonight, we will hear from David Brock in a program called The Life and Legacy of Edward Ellsworth Guy, Smokejumper and Humanitarian. First, let me tell you a little bit about tonight's guest speaker. Dave is the former presiding evangelist in Community of Christ. He served as a president of 70 and as an apostle for a number of years in the church. Dave's assignments included spots all over the world that helped shape and mold who he is today. His experience learning and living in the global church in places like Latin America, Africa, and the Pacific Islands were especially significant in his life. David's educational background includes a Bachelor of Science from the University of Oregon and a Master of Arts in Religion from Park University. David has completed further studies at a variety of institutions. Many of them I cannot pronounce correctly, but I assure you he's a very, very educated man and educated all over the world, and it's a blessing to have him here tonight. Welcome, Dave, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'll turn the microphone over to you now as we are all ready to hear the story of Ed Guy.
Well, thank you, Barb, and thanks to all of you who have tuned in from around the world. It's great to see the countries and states represented. I see a lot of names that I recognize. As I was looking through the list, I thought the city that wins the prize for being most interesting to me is Pflugerville, Texas. Thanks for being here from Pflugerville. So without further ado, we'll begin. And I have a PowerPoint that I'll share with you, I hope. Hopefully you all can see that. So welcome, and we begin. The Life and Legacy of Edward Ellsworth Guy, 1934 to 2001. Edward Ellsworth Guy came into the world in Santa Monica, California on August 26, 1934. He was the son of Florence Mormon Guy from Knob Noster, Missouri, and John Guy, who was born in England, grew up in Vancouver and Calgary, Canada, then moved to the United States to work as an airplane mechanic and later as a much sought after engineer. Florence and John met during the Great Depression when he was working for Trans World Airlines at the Kansas City Municipal Airport, and she as a waitress in a restaurant in the city. They were married in Kansas City on September 5th, 1933. Because of his dad's work with TWA and with the federal government during World War II, the family moved a lot. So Ed's childhood and youth found him in California, Missouri, Washington, D.C., Washington State, and Oregon. One of his two sisters described him as a sensitive boy, but also one who had a strong temper. He could really lose it, recalls Sister Eva. Though close to his mother, the relationship with his father was difficult. They simply didn't get each other. John had high expectations, was very critical of Ed, and disappointed that he was not inclined to engineering. A farmer Ed worked for in Oregon, a dairy farmer, I believe, and a neighbor who worked at the YMCA in Los Angeles were mentors and support for Ed during those years. He graduated from high school in Salem, Oregon in 1953. He did not participate in team sports, but he was active in Future Farmers of America. Following high school, Ed attended Graceland College in Iowa. After a year there, however, he knew college was not a right fit at that time. So he joined the Army and served for 2 years in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. He completed his bachelor's degree at Central Washington College, then continued his studies, receiving a master's degree in social work from the University of Missouri in Columbia. Ed lived most of his 6.5 decades among the poor of Latin America, specifically in Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Any account of his life is a profile of a servant minister. So many times he gave away his last peso, lempita, or dollar and threw in his shirt and shoes if needed. He slept on dirt floors and narrow benches to accompany the sick, the dying, and the imprisoned. He prayed with those who feared for their lives as bullets flew through homes and shops during El Salvador's civil war. He started projects to bring a small income to refugees in tent camps. He saved a drug-addicted woman literally pulled from a gutter in San Salvador, and over many years nurtured her one faltering step at a time back to safety and health. He helped the endangered escape to Canada in an underground railroad of sorts, saving the lives of several marked for murder. After the mass killings in El Salvador and Guatemala, he worked tirelessly and at great risk to expose those unspeakable crimes and helped families recover the remains of loved ones from unmarked burial sites. He anointed the heads of the ill and prayed for healing. He walked into family and community conflict as peacemaker and reconciler. He told the stories of the Bible and Book of Mormon. He helped plant churches in rough and tumble mining towns, remote mountain villages, and amidst the chaos and daily scramble for survival in the urban centers of Mexico and Central America. That's all true. Here's what else is true. No one laughed more than Ed Guy. He loved to tell stories of adventures as a smoke jumper in Idaho, or as a commercial fisherman on a vessel off the coast of Alaska, most often making himself the brunt of any awkward or embarrassing moments. He could banter and gently tease with the children or the cook at the neighborhood restaurant. He could bend you over in laughter while walking a steep mountain trail. He could pray the most heartfelt prayer for healing in one sacred sacramental moment, then leave the patient and her family smiling and chuckling or simply laughing out loud the next. In the most difficult of circumstances, Ed found ways to celebrate and laugh and embody unfettered joy. He died of a heart attack on the streets of Guatemala City on a mission to work with FAMDEGUA, an organization dedicated to seeking justice for the families of the disappeared. He could just as easily have died drinking a warm Coca-Cola while telling a joke on himself. His brother-in-law, Dan Greenwald, shared the following at Ed's memorial service at Samish Island, Washington in 2001. All you had to do was tell Ed about your cause, said Dan, and it became Ed's cause too. Ed was passionate about what he believed in, passionate in his desire to help, passionate in his desire to give aid and comfort, and passionate in his desire for justice. Wherever there was suffering, Ed suffered. Wherever there was injustice, Ed agonized, and wherever there was pain, Ed anguished. Ed was always searching for what more he could do to help. He accepted these challenges willingly, but no one can sustain the amount of emotional punishment Ed endured, and no one's heart, even one filled with as much love as Ed's, can survive the frustration of living in a world with so much pain, suffering, and injustice. Ed had an open mind and an open heart, said Dan. No preconceived notions, no judgments. He was never condescending, never patronizing. He was a teacher and he was a learner. He was a talker. Oh man, was he a talker. Ed was the poster child for the dangers of caffeine. Once he got that motor running, the best thing to do was hang on or just get out of the way. The cornerstone of Ed's life was his faith. His faith was unyielding, steadfast, resolute, tenacious, and absolute. Ed's faith was what bound him, what motivated him, what inspired him, what gave him joy, and what ultimately gave him the strength to sacrifice his life. Edward Ellsworth Guy literally gave his life in the service of others. He did it willingly, consciously, and without hesitation. He asked for and expected nothing in return. Ed's sister Eva provided key insights about her brother in an email of April 16, 2016. My mother said she dedicated Ed to God when she carried him. I'd say it took. She was so proud of him. She was like an Irish Catholic mother whose son became a priest. He was a Community of Christ version of a priest, living a life of poverty and foregoing the comfort of a wife and family. Obedient to authority, not so much. Our father was not a spiritual man, says Eva, but a very ethical man. He didn't understand Ed at all, and they were not emotionally close. He was a stiff upper lip Englishman who seldom showed his emotions, especially to Ed, but I know he loved him very much, and losing Ed was hard on him. He was so proud to go to World Conference after Ed died and was honored. I think he finally got it. From then on, he wanted to hear or read all about Ed's life and work. Words from Eva, who loved her brother. I met Ed, me, Dave, in January 1978 when Thad Wilson organized the first Community of Christ youth camp in Honduras. I was living in Mexico City at the time, so flew into San Pedro Sula for the event. At the end of the camp at La Buena Fe, Ed asked if we would accompany him to offer ministry in El Carreto on Sunday morning. Eager for adventure, Thad wasn't so sure, but I quickly said yes, not knowing what we were in for. We arose early after a night of rain and for 3 hours climbed the slippery mountain to the home of the Hernandez family. We arrived to the best cup of coffee I'd ever tasted. Raised, harvested, dried, roasted, ground, and brewed right there at their homestead. Then we shared in a memorable worship of prayer and testimony. Sometimes Ed rode a horse through the mountains. Occasionally, he hitchhiked on the seldom traveled dirt and gravel roads. Mostly, though, he walked, often by whatever moonlight was available as he arose early enough to get from Saturday night services in one village to morning services up the mountain. or he would lead a class in San Pedro Sula, finish in time to catch a vehicle to Lake Yohoa, paddle across, often in the agitated waves of late afternoon, and arrive for an evening service at Orconcitos or Mogote. Then he would often sleep on a narrow bench at the church. After worship and a meal in El Carreto on that Sunday of January 1978, we were able to catch a Land Rover headed down the logging road. We stopped in a small town along the way and learned that there had been a knife fight at a wedding the night before. Because of the conflict, Ed stayed behind to try to bring reconciliation. He sent us back to La Buena Fe, promising to catch up later. The next day, we returned to San Pedro Sula without Ed, who was still dealing with the crisis in the mountain village. He showed up in the very early morning of the following day. And along with 70 Tony Jimenez, we drove in Tony's pickup to Chimaltenango, Guatemala. We traveled to the village where Ed had worked following the devastating earthquake of 1976. We made our way down a very steep logging road into La Estancia de la Virgen to meet Rolando Alvarado and his family and share with them in conversation and prayer. As the sun moved across the sky, we kept insisting to Ed that we best leave the valley while there was still light. Because the road was so steep, Tony's pickup couldn't make the climb out, so we all jumped out and pushed until exhausted. We were tired and not a little frustrated with Ed for getting us into this mess. He chided us gently by saying, "This is the Lord's work, and we need to have more faith and pray for God's help. This is what ministry is all about," he told us. We, frankly, were in no mood to pray there on that mountain road, exhausted from pushing the vehicle whose tires were now significantly worn down, and Tony was not happy about his vehicle. He chided it. No, sorry, I skipped around. So we were exhausted from pushing the vehicle, and we made Ed pray because we didn't want to pray. We pushed and tried to be more pleasant, more faithful, and a little bit more prayerful. After a while, we finally reached the paved road where Ed had us stop the vehicle, get out, and praise God for protecting us and making a way out of no way. That was Ed Guy. Thus began my relationship with Edward Ellsworth Guy. We had little further interaction until 1994, when I began a 6-year assignment as apostle for Latin America. By then, Ed was living full-time in El Salvador. The Civil War had ended, but poverty and violence, mistrust and trauma were always at hand. Refugees began to return from the inner cities of Chicago and Los Angeles to the chaos of their home country. Many of them youth who had learned the lifestyle of gangs and were now involved in the drug trade. They wreaked absolute havoc on the cities and even in the countryside where policing was corrupt or simply non-existent. As I visited members and friends of the church in El Salvador, I heard story after story of lives saved by Ed during the war. Persons who were sent to safety on an underground railroad from El Salvador to Canada, persons to whom Ed delivered much needed food in conflicted neighborhoods by skirting the rebels and or talking his way past government soldiers, sometimes with the benefit of a handkerchief waved as a white flag. Ed once saw a soldier about to shoot an unarmed rebel. Ed jumped from behind a building, ran into the street, and yelled at the soldier, "In the name of the Lord, I command you not to kill that man." The shocked soldier turned and ran. Ed thanked God, and the story is still told time and time again in the villages and streets of El Salvador. In the years I was privileged to work with him, he was supporting Salvadoran church leaders, planning the church in Guatemala, and giving time, money, and lots of encouragement to development projects funded by Outreach International or World Accord, primarily in refugee camps and with indigenous women's cooperatives. He began to focus both locally and internationally on the dangerous work of finding the bodies of the disappeared and trying to bring to trial persons responsible for thousands of citizens murdered during the Civil War in Guatemala. He also lobbied to recover remains of soldiers missing in action in Vietnam. Ed was a man of the people. He lived with the poor. He simply lived poor. He was a person of adventure and risk, in part because of his personality, but more so because of his faith and his values. Ed was a man of prayer. He knew the value of his own personal prayer and meditation time alone amidst the constant pressing presence of others. He could just as easily pray on a street corner or in a circle of seekers in a noisy market as in a church building. He prayed around countless hospital beds, but also while lying on the floor of a house reciting Psalm 91, praying the flying bullets would not kill his friends. You will not fear the terror of night, says that psalm, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in the darkness, nor the plague that destroys at midday. It makes me wonder what Ed would be saying to us today in the midst of this pandemic. He prayed just as naturally in those circumstances as in congregational worship. The scriptures mattered to Ed. He read them, meditated on them, memorized them, preached and taught. He knew the stories of Jesus. They were models and guides that shaped his life and ministry. Bible and Book of Mormon stories were his story, woven into the days and years and decades of his living. Ed believed deeply in the sacraments, especially baptism and laying on of hands for the sick. As Daryl Mink, an appointing minister to Latin America for 30-some years, often said, Ed was a true Christian, a person of faith who made you a person of faith. He believed in answered prayer, and if you were around him long enough, you'd be a believer too. Daryl was fond of recounting the time Ed asked him to go to a hospital in San Salvador at the end of a long day to pray for a friend who was ill. Daryl was tired and did not want to go, but Ed, ever persistent, prevailed, and Daryl, with quite a bit of reluctance, accompanied him as Ed talked his way past the soldiers and medical staff long after visiting hours were over. The hymns sung and prayers offered on behalf of Ed's friend led to requests for prayer from the other patients in the room. Then the nursing staff demanded that they not only pray for the patients, but they pray for the nurses as well. Ed then remembered another patient in another room further down the hall. After prayer with him, that person referred the party of prayers to a military officer on another floor. Hours after entering the hospital, Ed, Daryl, and other local ministers left for home, and Daryl back to his hotel. He said it was one of the most powerful experiences of his ministry career. Ed would get you into those kinds of situations, pretty much daily, in fact. Often he had to drag you because it was untimely, ever inefficient, virtually always unplanned, impractical, and sometimes even dangerous. Afterward, you realized what he did was what Jesus would have done, and you were a richer person for having participated. Ed often relied on his intuition to guide him. Sometimes when he entered a space, you could see him subtly use his downturned up open hand to feel whether there was good energy or bad in the room. He paid attention to vibes, he called them, that he got in the presence of strangers. Ed entertained almost every stranger as the Christ. He could always find the good in anyone, no matter how hidden. On occasion, however, particularly during the years of the Civil War, he learned to trust his intuitions regarding whether or not a person was a danger to him or others. He said he could feel evil. I learned not to question him. Ed neglected his own self-care. He had pills for congestive heart failure, which we found rolling freely in plastic bottles in an otherwise empty suitcase. He said they made him feel funny, so he stopped taking them. Doctors who he rarely visited recommended a change in eating habits, but he loved his salt and soft drinks and never ate anything but what those around him ate. He often went without. If he bought food, he bought the cheapest. The years of exposure to bacteria and parasites took their toll. Ed usually laughed it off. Illness slowed him, though. As he aged, he took longer to get started at the beginning of the day, but he never lost his drive to get up, to go, to do, to be with. Never. Ed never married. He apparently had a few romantic interests, but his sense of call to adventure and to ministry with the poor did not fit well with the wherever you go, I will go commitments of marriage. Ed was shy, frightened by romance, and likely unwilling and unable to make the significant life changes he knew a good marriage would require. There are credible accounts of a Honduran woman who loved him and for whom he held considerable affection. She would have welcomed marriage, but he continued his outward bound ways. Gone from Honduras for 7 years, he returned to find that she'd married. Ed told me that he likely would have married her if she had just waited a little bit longer. He had habits that were both endearing and, I hope it's okay to say, frustrating. He would walk into a worship service, often arriving to a congregation that had been waiting for some time, and immediately launch into hymns or choruses, never melodic, but always spirited and with plenty of volume. In later years, he would often fall asleep in services, but had the ability to be connected enough to arise at the right moment for heartfelt prayer or moving testimony. Ed had a theory that the olive oil consecrated for the prayer of healing could protect the minister from the illness of the one being prayed for, so he had the habit of anointing and rubbing his hands liberally and vigorously with the oil before offering the prayer. The local ministers, much to our chagrin, I must confess, followed his habit faithfully. His brother-in-law shared more about ways Ed both endeared and frustrated. Here's what he says. Ed didn't live in one of the conventional time zones like you and I. He lived in EST, Ed Standard Time, which is anywhere from 2 hours to 2 months behind whatever time zone you live in. We took to playing with the times a little when Ed was around in order to get places on time. If we had to be someplace at noon, it was better to tell Ed we had to be there at 10. The person of the moment was the one who mattered for Ed. There may be government agency appointments to keep, taxis to catch, sermons to preach, but if a person in need arrived or was in his path, future plans were of little significance until the present need was attended to. You could almost never board a flight out of El Salvador without hearing your name called over the loudspeaker, asking you to return to immigration, where Ed would be waiting to ask one more question or share one more idea for ministry. It always had to do with the needs of others or ideas about extending the mission of the church to new people and places. Like the Christian mystics through the ages, Ed shared an intimacy with God that most of us don't have, or at least not often. He embodied so many of the fruits of the Spirit in his living. He lived out the principles and values that many of us hold up and talk about, but I'll speak of me, only sporadically demonstrate. I don't think I've met another human being who valued equally the poorest person alongside the rich and famous. No one was more sensitive to the well-being of those wounded by life, unacknowledged, or unaware of their own worth. Ed was savvy, but there was an innocence about him, a naivete, a simple childlike faith in God and in humanity. He understood, I think, that God is indeed mystery. God is transcendent and wholly other. Mostly for Ed, however, God was personal, intimate, immanent, present, Abba. God was engaged in every aspect and detail of life. If it was mealtime, whoever was present was invited. If we were taking a taxi or bus to another town and a friend or acquaintance, often several friends and acquaintances, was with him, he would find a way to squeeze that person in and pay the fare. His response to our questions about costs, transport, efficiency of time, etc., were always met with him insisting that this was a teaching and learning moment for the local member and that we couldn't let it pass. If we needed to leave someone behind, he would stay behind and find a cheaper way to come later. In her book, The Silent Cry, Mysticism and Resistance, Dorothy Soella says something that Ed Guy embodied. He was the man of what she called crazy mysticism, who God led to transforming actions. Here's her quote. The basis of spiritual renewal is not the guilt feelings that frequently arise in sensitized individuals in rich industrial societies. Instead, it is a crazy mysticism of becoming empty that reduces the real misery of the poor and diminishes one's own slavery. Becoming empty or letting go of the ego, possession, and violence is the precondition of the creativity of transforming action. Ed and Marina Ramos de Merino were given the first International Human Rights Award for service to humanity at the 1994 World Conference. In the presentation of the award, Lorene Hageman, chair of the Human Rights Committee, recounted the many arenas of ministry in which Ed served as social worker, development expert, advocate, missionary, and pastor in Mexico, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, Australia, the United States, and elsewhere. She closed her speech with these words: woven through all his labors are ministries of spiritual comfort and pastoral sensitivity. He demonstrates a powerful faith, high personal values, and a boundless love for persons of all stations in life. Perhaps the impact and effectiveness of the ministry and service of Edward Ellsworth Guy are best perceived in the hundreds of persons who call out to him by name in city streets and byways where he has been a force for the highest ideals of Christianity. He is a living paradigm of the Good Samaritan. Lloyd Hirschman summarized Ed Guy's years of service by stating, perhaps very few are called to be homeless in order to reach out to the homeless, to be hungry if by that means the hungry might be fed, to sacrifice health and life expectancy that others might live. But to Edward Guy, human being of note, this is the normal course of life. When Ed died in Guatemala on September 21st, 2001, church members from El Salvador and Guatemala arranged for a viewing and memorial service before his body was returned to the United States for burial. They didn't have enough money to buy a casket, so quietly worked out an unofficial arrangement to borrow a casket for a few hours. Ed would have been quite okay with that and undoubtedly would have found it humorous. He would have been angry, in fact, if his friends had wasted their limited finances to otherwise honor his death. Ed is buried near his father and mother in Bayview Cemetery near Samish Island, Washington. His tombstone simply reads, as you can see, well done, good and faithful servant. And thus, a little bit about the life of an amazing servant of Jesus.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for sharing your research on Ed Guy with us tonight. It almost feels like the history of a saint in the way that you share it. Also, thank you to Peter and Megan for helping co-host tonight and for all of your behind the scenes magic. Lastly, we share our thanks to you, our friends in the audience, for sharing your time with us and for generously supporting the Community of Christ historic sites with your donations tonight. We simply could not host educational programs like tonight's lecture without your generous support. Thank you for helping preserve and share church heritage. Until next time, take care, keep reading your church history, and have a blessed night.